Hello, Ben's here.
Hi, Ben, Dylan, others. We still have 3 minutes to go, so we'll give everyone a chance to roll in before we get things started.
And I saw Chuck earlier today. He said he was not going to be able to make it.
Right. Yeah, Clifton let me know as well.
Okay. Great.
Hi, everyone. We'll wait for another minute or two. Clifton will be joining us, so I want to give him time to sign in.
I'm here, Francisco.
Okay, you are. Very good.
Yep.
All right. You dialed in, is that right?
Yeah, I'm on my phone.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. And for all others, if you're not speaking, please keep your microphones on mute so we don't get feedback. Okay, Clifton, it's 7 o'clock. We have, I believe we have a critical mass, so I'll leave it to you as to when you'd like to officially get things started.
Sounds good. Do we have at least 3 commissioners on? I can't see the attendees.
I believe that we do. Ben, can you confirm that? We've got Ben, Gary, Don. Folks are all commissioners, correct?
Not Don. But yeah, we have Gary. I see Mary Ellen, Ben. I think so. I'm not sure I'm seeing everybody here.
And Lynn just signed in as well. So yeah.
Oh, good. Okay.
We do.
Yeah, I think we're ready to go.
Okay. All right. I guess since I know Chuck isn't here, Ben, do you want to do the formal call it to order, or somebody?
Sure. let's see, where are we? The 6/12 review of the previous town rewrite meeting, getting ready for our next presentation virtually on the 24th, I believe it is, right, Francisco?
It is 2 weeks from tonight, which
Right.
puts it on the 26th.
26, excuse me. And my,
Yeah,
Yep.
Wednesday, 26th at
Okay.
6 p.m.
yeah,
Correct.
so let's commence the meeting.
Perfect.
Okay, very
I don't
good.
have too much. I don't have too much to add at the beginning here. I just wanted to, get out and address something that I've heard through people calling my office or other offices at Town Hall. The recommendations that are before everyone tonight, as the commission may know, and if you've attended our meetings quite frequently, you already know, these will be subject to a formal public hearing process later. It is the approach that we've taken in order to streamline everything to go through phase by phase, section by section with these recommendations. So the recommendations that you see tonight are not ones that are going to be approved tonight or at the next meeting in 2 weeks. Just wanted to clarify that because there seemed to be some misinformation going around. So with that, I'll just turn that back over to Francisco. We can get started.
Okay, thank you, Clifton. And I'm going to do my best to get this presentation started while I let people into the meeting at the same time. So if I'm a little distracted, it's because I'm switching between screens, letting people in. With that being said, let me put this in full screen mode. And we'll go over our agenda for this evening, and it's really very straightforward. Okay. So first, as we usually do, we'll take a look at where we're at with our project schedule. And then we'll jump right into the recommended residential district amendments. Everything that we are reviewing this evening was discussed at our meeting 2 weeks ago. The purpose of us reviewing the same content tonight is to come to agreement as to what we want to carry forward to a public presentation in 2 weeks and what we would like to share with the public regarding things that we're considering carrying forward. That would, as Clifton pointed out, at a later date, and most likely months from now, all be considered for being brought forward to a public hearing for adoption. However, we're in the phase of really deciding what we want to share with the public, what we'd like to carry forward, and we still have a lot of work to do in this process. So this is definitely a work in progress. And that being said, we really invite the public to participate in this. All these meetings are open to the public. The purpose of our meeting in 2 weeks is to invite the public in to share the work that we've been doing with them. So to the extent that we have members of the public attending this evening, please do stick around. We've got a presentation that'll take, I hope, not more than an hour. And then we will open it up to questions and comments at the end. So that being said, let me jump into this. Our schedule, we're nowhere near the end, but we're nearing the end of this particular phase of work, which is our review of housing and residential zoning districts. Our next step in this process, as I mentioned, is in 2 weeks to conduct a public presentation. And for those of you that don't have your microphones on mute, please put your microphones on mute or your phones on mute so that we don't get feedback. I'm hearing some feedback. Thank you. Okay, so we have a number of recommended amendments, and you'll notice we start at number 18 because our previous segment of work, and if I go back to the slide before, involved environmental resource protection, sustainability, and resilience, of which we had 17 recommendations specific to that content. So we are sequentially numbering these. So our residential district and housing recommendations start at number 18. And I will go through each one of these. I would like to move through them a lot faster than I did at our last meeting, because the last meeting was the first time I introduced them to the commission. Here you're seeing them again. In some cases, we've done a little bit of additional research that you asked for. My goal this evening is you to tell us, to let me know as commissioners, what you're interested in carrying forward as written to our public presentation in 2 weeks. Okay? All right, so let's get into it. Recommendation 18 was to rezone areas to reduce lot size nonconformity. So the primary purpose is to rezone existing areas. Some of them are zoned R80, some of them are zoned RC 120, because they have lots that are non-conforming in size, and not a few lots, but a majority of the lots, or many, many lots that are non-conforming in size. That's the purpose. For the most part, we rezone them to districts that allow for similar types of uses. There may be some small changes in what's allowed, but by and large, we're proposing to rezone these areas to uses that allow the same types of uses. It would just allow for lots that are non-conforming in size, meaning they're not big enough, as the zoning is written for the zone they're in, to be conforming. And the point and the purpose of this is so that people, when they want to build a garage or put in a swimming pool, whatever it may be, they don't have to go to ZBA to get a variance because their lot is undersized for the zoning district, which technically, given the authority to ZBAs by the state of Connecticut, is really outside of their authority to regularly grant variances of that nature. So that's a bad practice. We want to reduce it or eliminate it by bringing properties into conformity. And we've been very surgical in our recommendations. We targeted areas that are highly non-conforming with respect to lot size. So the total area that we're talking about, that we're recommending to rezone, is 1,500 acres. It comprises 5.5% of Stonington's land area. We don't anticipate adverse impacts. We definitely anticipate fewer variance requests. So I'll walk through those areas. There are small areas in some cases, and larger areas in other cases. So they range in size, and here we are, Clark's Village, south of Pawcatuck, range in size from 17 acres to 26.3 acres. And so one by one, area one, we found that 129 of the 129 lots in this area are undersized for the zone. They are not 80,000 square foot lots. They're substantially less. Many of them around 15,000 square feet. Area two, 12 of 12 lots are undersized. So we're recommending a change from the RC 120 to the RA. That area is well away from the shore. The RC 120 is really intended to protect coastal areas. It's arguably in a coastal area, but it's well away from the shore. Area three, change from RC 120 to RA 120 or RA 20. 27 of the 27 lots in this area are all undersized. None of them meet the RC 120, which is 120,000 square foot minimum lot size requirement. And then area four, 46 of the 46 lots here do not meet the RC 120 lot size standard. We recommend changing to an RA 20, which is comparable to this entire yellow area north of it. So these two areas are surrounded by RA 20. They're not zoned RA 20. We recommend zoning like the surrounding areas. The RC 120 and RA 20 have almost identical uses that are allowed in those districts. So this is really about lot size, and then of course other standards as well, like setbacks and coverage. And I've got three of these pages, so bear with me. The next, we have areas like area number 5, 24 of 59 lots are undersized. Area 6, 63 of the 66. Area 7, 281 of 291 lots are non-conforming. And then the one I expect will really generate the most discussion and debate, but we put it on the table and are certainly looking for the commission's direction on this, because I think this would be the biggest move, and the one probably there would be the strongest arguments against. would be changing this area. It is the largest area recommended, over 1,000 acres, from RR80 to RA40. More than half, 199, slightly more than half of the lots, of the 385 lots, are non-conforming in lot size in this area. That's the purpose. I should also note this area is well served by some arterial roadways, and areas within this area are served by public water and sewer. So there's certainly been demonstrated the capacity from an infrastructure perspective to handle more development. The question is, from policy perspective, is it the right thing to do? So I expect this one, this may be the most difficult decision, given the size of the area and the nature of the change. So you asked us to quantify some of this, so we ran some calculations, taking a look at the difference. If we rezoned all these areas, how would that change the composition of our zoning districts in Stonington? So what we see is the GB 130 is unaffected. We're not talking about changing any of those zones, so that stays at nearly 24% of Stonington, of the residential districts in Stonington. The RC 120 would reduced slightly by 0.3%, from 13% of the residential districts to 12.7%. The RR80, that would be the biggest decrease here in terms of acres. In terms of share, it would drop about 7% from 43% to 36.7%. Remember, that's that 1,000+ area that we've recommended rezoning from RR80 to RA40. And here you'll notice in the nomenclature that I'm getting into the new proposed zone names, which I'll review again further down into the presentation. Then finally, the changes down here at the bottom, RA15 would increase to 7.9% because we're adding to that. RM15 would increase from 1.3 to 3.9. Once again, we're adding to that. RH10 would increase from 2.8 to 3.2. So these are relatively small, with the exception of RA15. These are pretty small increases. You'll notice we don't have figures here. That's because later on into the presentation, I'll discuss our recommendation to merge the RA20 with the RA15. Both those districts allow exactly the same uses. They just have different lot size requirements. And the same as the RM20. We've recommended merging that with the RM15. Exact same uses are allowed, just different lot sizes. So these numbers here would get added into to these right here. And then our final composition, this is what it would look like if all of these proposed changes were made. The RA80 remains the largest share of the zoning districts. So even though we've proposed shifting 1,000 acres over to RA40, it still overwhelmingly is the largest zoning district at over 1/3. The RG20 is next at nearly 1/4, followed by the RC 120, then the R40. And these districts where we're proposing rezoning lots to still remain a small fraction of the districts in Stonington, of the residential districts. Okay. So that being said, I'd open it up to the commissioners. Any comments on this? Any ideas for moving forward with this recommendation?
Francisco, this is Lynn. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Lynn, once again, I have terrible feedback. If you could, as you did in the last meeting, turn off the audio, not just mute yourself on the computer, but actually turn the computer audio off or turn the volume of the computer all the way down. That would
Okay,
help.
I think I just did that.
You already did. Fantastic. Better already. Thank you. Thank you.
So I think that we talked about, and I really appreciate this this slide. I think it puts things in perspective really well. So great work there. I think last time when we talked about RR80 and RA40, it did seem like a very large, number of acres. I was thinking to myself as I was looking at the map, is there a rationale to only change some of the R80
I'll
to
go back.
R40? Is there any kind of a rationale to do that? Because,
Yep.
you're doubling the amount of RA40. Yeah.
It's a great question. We could be a little more precise. We are broad brush with this recommendation. That being said, those non-conforming lots are really scattered all across this area. And we'd end up with zoning districts that are even more fragmented with pieces, all over, depending how granular we got.
Yeah, because I'm looking at the map and I'm looking to the right where it says RR80 to RA45, where it says 5. That seems to me to be the most non-conforming. Am I right there? The percentage?
Yeah, it really is scattered. If you can see my cursor, I'll point to areas.
Okay.
All of this is almost all of this, with exception of maybe this parcel, a couple of them, non-conforming. Most of this.
By Flanders.
This entire cluster up here, non-conforming. This cluster in here, largely non-conforming. We have another cluster here, largely non-conforming. So we could certainly, and you can see all these are large lots. These are all conforming back here. In the core, in the center here, and in this up here, and then this cluster. So we could certainly get more precise and granular. It just comes at the expense of really fragmenting things.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, because I think in that section 8, I think that's where you've got Montauk, right? Is in that section.
Yes,
and that's where you've got those. It's kind of in the middle, isn't it? Yeah, I'm just thinking. Those are all conforming lots. Those lots on Montauk, and I'm thinking that's where I think you're messing with something that we're thinking about changing something that doesn't need to be changed. I mean, I understand it's great to have everything look pretty on the map and everything's all connected and all this, but as I can understand it, for a lot of this, I just feel as if for the sake of having large chunks, we're kind of missing that whole section of just, hey, there's no reason to mess with that. Leave well enough alone. I'm going to put myself on mute, and hopefully I don't mess the echo up again.
Okay. I think you're good. Thank you, Lynn. Anyone else want to weigh in, given Lynn's thoughts?
This is Ben Philbrick. I'm still sort of on the fence about the R80 to RA40. The rest of your suggestions make sense, a whole lot of sense to me. It's just this is such a big chunk. I need to digest it further, and I haven't really made up my mind yet, to be quite honest.
Okay.
This is Gary. The same. The others all, I mean, my God, some are 100%. If we could see, like you said, a little more fine-grained, then maybe. I'm all for making things simple, but if we could just see if it's a little more sliced up.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's do this. We'll take another approach to this. We'll be a little more precise, try to protect more of the R80, see if there really are some strong concentrations of lots that are more in line with RA 40 that make for a stronger argument. And then we can come back to you, and we can hold this. We don't necessarily have to present it at the next meeting. We could carry it over in our work. And we just kind of keep chipping away at it until we figure this one out. But I'm hearing general consensus on the rest of the areas. Is that right?
I definitely, for me, I agree. For the rest of the areas, yes.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Yes, this is Ben.
Okay.
Yes.
Can I just ask you one other question, Francisco, before we leave this?
Yes.
North Main, North Main is R80, right? And that's not in this proposal, the 1,000 acres, 0.8, right? Because you're right. Am I correct there? I'm thinking, looking at the map, that's correct.
The northern limit of this is at I-95. That's where we split it. So north of 95, RR80 continues all the way north to the town boundary, north of 95. 95 seemed like a very logical place to split the zone. And so that's the boundary. As to whether or not North Main is in it, I'm not sure.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we'll hold off on this recommendation. We'll do a little more work on it. We'll come back to it at a subsequent meeting, but I think we'll hold off from presenting this to the public in 2 weeks because it's not quite ready. Okay. All right. Also, I think this is, I think we all have agreement on this. It was brought to our attention, there are 3 parcels that were, looks like mistakenly zoned GB30. They were part of this entire development to the south, this RH10. So we're gonna advance this recommendation as well.
Agree.
Okay. All right, recommendation 19 is to adjust frontage and setback standards. And once again, the primary purpose of this is to bring properties into conformity. The frontage and setback standards vary per zoning district. And the bigger the district, the more stringent, if you want to describe it that way, those standards are requiring bigger distances, larger measurements, larger setbacks. We found in our work that much like lot size, many properties are non-conforming, which really makes things problematic for a property owner who would like to do something with their property. And this is across the board, townwide, with some districts having higher degree of non-conformity than others. Additionally, what we found is that as we examined the numbers across the different districts, there wasn't necessarily a rational basis or a mathematical basis for those numbers. It seemed like just a group of people came to a consensus that those seemed to be reasonable numbers. So we've, in our recommendations here, we've tried to take a more mathematical approach to that and to be more proportional with respect to the measurements versus the lot size. So I'll go through the minimum frontage. The changes we recommend are in red, and across the board, we're talking about reductions in those frontage requirements. And as a reminder, the frontage is the width of the lot where it meets the road. So you have to have a minimum amount in order to build something on that lot, even if you have the lot size and everything else. If you don't have that frontage on the road, you can't build. So what we're proposing is really to bring it in line with something that's more consistent with what we've actually found in the field. We see a lot of properties that are at these measurements or above, and something that's slightly more linear and progressive. So as you go up in lot size, instead of just jumping sporadically by huge numbers, it's a little more proportional to the actual lot size. So the reductions we see are recommended anywhere from 8% to 40%. Now, that doesn't affect the lot size. One thing that remains unchanged in these districts is we're not proposing lot size changes, unless we're talking about rezoning an area or properties to a different district, which has a different lot size, we're not talking about changing the R80 to anything other than an 80,000 square foot requirement. This is about frontage. So there's that standard. The next standard is front yard. Front yard is the setback from the street line that's required of any principal structure or other structures. And what we've seen is a large degree of nonconformity as well across town. So we've recommended reductions that are once again proportional to the lot size and progressive as you go up. And so reductions anywhere from 20% to 50% across the board. And down here is where we had the greatest degree of nonconformity. We really a lot of properties that don't conform with the setback standard.
Francesco, I had a quick question on that.
Yes, yes, of course, yeah.
So in the RA15, RM15,
Yeah.
RH10, where, those are some pretty significant reductions. My question is, by making the reduction 50%, well, let me ask it a different way. How did you come up with the 50%? Was it that you looked at all the nonconformities and you said, for example, on the RH10, if we made it, 10 foot, then all the nonconformities go away? Or did you just say, well, how did you come up with the 10, that 50%?
Yeah, more or less as you just described it. So we did not, and I don't want to misrepresent the extent of our work. We did not measure every single property. We sampled across the districts. Okay. We did random samples of front yard setbacks. And what we found is that many properties, and let's use the RH10 as an example, have setbacks that are only 10 feet. So if we want to bring, and this is not 100%, but if we want to bring a majority of the properties into conformity based upon our sampling, these are the setbacks that would be required. So it's not that we were aiming for a 50% reduction. That's what it turned out to be. It's that these are the setbacks required to bring most of the properties into conformity with the standards.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. All right. Side yard setback as well. I think this one generated the most discussion last month. We had initially proposed changing the 10-foot setback that is currently applicable to all these smaller districts, smaller lot size districts, to match what is currently in place for the RA15, which is a combined setback of 20 feet, but no less than 5 feet. So it really achieves something very similar to the 10-foot setback on both sides, in that you get a total of 20 feet of setback when both sides are combined, but it allows one side to go down to as little as 5 feet. I know there was a lot of concern about structures ending up 10 feet apart and things becoming congested. So we went back and we came up with an alternative proposal. And that is really to maintain the 10 feet and actually even change the current RA15 requirement to 10 feet, because we found within the RA15, we really found that an overwhelming number of properties actually do have 10-foot setbacks, at least. Very few have only a 5-foot setback. Where this is most needed is the RH10. That is where we have the greatest degree of nonconformity. And I've got a couple of images for you that are typical of many streets on either the east side of town or west side of town. So we think that this approach would be most beneficial in the RH10. And so we're now only recommending it for that district. Okay. So let's take a look at those images. Isham Street and Mystic. So the property line is somewhere here, right? It's either on this where this fence is, or maybe even a little bit over here. This is an adjacent property. They're right near the property line. This house here is probably 10 feet setback, but this is close. So we have a total distance here that is probably less than 20 feet. And the same is true on this side. This house is really close to the property line. Setback's a little greater here. So we have a total distance on this side is probably around 20 feet. And there are many, many examples of this. So there's a very clear example of where there's not a 10-foot setback. And the same is true on this side. And if we go to the other side of town, you could see just where the lawn is mowed, where that property line is, right? It's right through here. It looks like this may have been a driveway at some point, a long time ago. On this side, about a 5-foot setback. On this side, not quite 10, maybe 8 feet. So there are lots and lots of examples of properties that simply don't comply with the 10-foot setback that's currently in place in the RH10 districts. A number of properties. These are just a couple of sample images. So a 5 and a combined 20 would, in this case, and if you could see to the edge at the left, at this side, the driveway's on that side. There's a car parked to the left. You'd be complying with the 5 feet on this side. On the other side, you would then be required to have 15 on that side, in which case, given the driveway there, I believe it's complying. And of course, that doesn't have to be distributed in that way. It could be 10 on this side and 10 on that side to get the combined 20. So it's really just adds flexibility. There's still a combined 20 feet required. And so I think this is where, going back to our recommended standards, RH10 is where this approach would be most beneficial. Any thoughts on those changes?
I really like this second recommendation. I think it's going to avoid a lot of issues in the RA20, RM20, and I can understand for the RH10, I think it makes sense to have one side, a minimum of 5, but a gross of 20. That does give the flexibility needed for the tighter lots.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Lynn. And anyone else?
This is Gary. I agree.
Okay. Gary, I think your phone's ringing. Okay, well, let's agree to move forward with this as proposed.
Hi. How you doing?
And Gary, you're not muted.
this is Ben.
So
I can't, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, that
Hold on.
makes sense.
I gotta mute my computer.
okay. All right, we've got it figured out. Okay, thank you. Rear yard, and this is the last item on this rear yard. We've been a little less aggressive here. I think the rear yard requirements are pretty good. We have a lower degree of nonconformity with the rear yard setbacks. That being said, a 40-foot rear yard requirement in the RA15 and RM15, the same as larger districts, and only 10 feet less than the RR80, it seems a little excessive. So once again, here in the spirit of being proportional to the lot size, to be more rational, we would recommend changing both those down to 30. In the RH10, we'd keep it as it is at 10% of the depth. That's the way it's developed, and those lots, some of them are tiny, and we don't want to disrupt the way that works. Okay, does that make sense?
I'm in favor. Ben.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm good with this
Yes.
too.
all right, thank you. So we'll move forward with those. Okay, recommendation 20 is to rename and merge residential districts. You have 9 residential districts. It's a lot for a town of your size. It's a lot for any town or city. We try to figure out a way to simplify this. The best we can do is get it down to 7. And I think as I walk you through, you understand why we stop at 7. I think we have some very obvious things that could happen, and the rest of them really would be forced. So let me walk you through what we proposed. So I've also talked about renaming, and that's just really to simplify and be more consistent. By example, the GBR 130 is a residential district. It doesn't start with R. It really should start with R, so it's instantly recognized as a residential district. So we recommend just renaming that RG 130. No other change. RC 120, we'll keep that. It makes sense. RR 80, we would just drop an R to R80 to simplify it. RA 40, no one knows what the A stands for, so we're just going to drop the A. It'll become R40. The RA 20 and RA 15 are almost exactly the same districts, with one difference is lot size and then some of the setback standards. All of the same uses, exactly the same uses. So we recommend merging those. And that once again helps us with many of these non-conforming lots that we have scattered all through town. The earlier proposal to rezone specific areas are just the hot spots where we have concentrations of overwhelming number of properties that are non-conforming. But non-conforming properties are really scattered throughout the town. They're peppered throughout. If we merge the RA 20 with the RA 15 and reduce the requirement for anything that's currently in the RA 20 to a 15,000 foot lot size and to the associated standards, we would bring a lot of properties into conformity without changing any of the uses that are allowed. And really, you would be hard pressed. You really can't tell a street that is in the RA 15 apart from a street that's in the RA 20. There's really no noticeable difference to the eye. We're talking about a 5,000 square foot difference. It's a pretty small area. And the same approach with the RM20 and RM15 is to merge the RM20 into the RM15, change name to the R15. Just like the RA20 and RA15, these districts allow exactly the same type of uses. The only difference is lot size and then some of the setback standards. So we'd merge those. The RH10 just renamed to R10 to simplify it. Now, I want to talk about this recommendation and the implications it has for everything else we just discussed with respect to setback standards. Because if we do merge these, then everything we talked about here for these standards for the RM20 and RM15, or excuse me, RA20 and RM20 is really moot because these districts would disappear and these standards would prevail. Okay. However, we have designed these recommendations to be standalone recommendations that can be advanced independent of each other. In case these changes get no traction, we can make these changes. And then if both go, then we adjust accordingly. All right. So many of these recommendations are interconnected and associated with one another. And the final approach will really depend upon how many of these recommendations get advanced, how many get ultimately adopted by the zoning commission. All right. And going forward, we're going to do our best to call attention to those implications. Lynn, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Francis.
Yeah,
So I understood what you were saying as far as the rear yard setback. Did the same apply for the side and front, that it would be mute if we combined?
Everything.
Everything.
Yeah,
Okay.
let me go back.
Yep.
We're talking about basically eliminating the RA20 district, taking all the properties that are currently in that district and merging them into the RA15 and adopting the RA15's lot standards. So if we go back to this, everything that's proposed here assumes that this recommendation does not move forward as recommended.
Right.
If it does, all these dimensions and everything on the slides preceding with respect to front and side yard setback, frontage, all of those disappear in the 15, whether it be RA15 or RM15 standards prevail. Okay. So proportionately, the biggest changes we would see would be in these two districts. because they're going down to a district that has lesser standards. And we're even talking about some reductions to those districts. So it's compounding.
Can you just flip back to the
Yeah.
the side yard one? Okay. So,
And
Okay.
as a reminder, the side yard, we decided not to touch that. So
right.
we wouldn't see any changes in the side yard for these districts. I
Okay.
may have said all, there would be changes across the board, but in this case, because it's the same standard, there are no implications for side yard. But if I go back to
Front yard.
front
Yeah.
yard, there are implications. Okay. And once again, if there is general agreement that we do want to move forward in consolidating districts, we could rediscuss this reduction and we could decide to instead hold this standard. Okay.
So let me just, yeah. So I just wonder,
Yeah.
So it makes no difference for the rear and the side, as you said. But for the front yard, would it be better?
Yeah.
And I don't know, to make it so there's no difference. What would that, you know what I mean? Would it be better
Yeah.
just to go in and say, we're just going to eliminate 2 of these zones, and it's not going to make a difference that we've eliminated them for the new zone, because we could do that if we change these front yard standards, right?
Yeah.
And what would that number be?
So that still, it kind of fails to achieve our objective of bringing properties that are non-conforming right now into conformity. So the number is currently 30. So if we didn't adjust the front yard, the required front yard, then merging these districts, there's no difference, right? It's 30 across the board. So there would be no difference. So I think the point you're getting at is merging districts would be probably a much easier sell, because we'd be changing less if we kept it at 30.
That's kind of what I was thinking, but if it doesn't meet the objective,
however, we see that there are many, many properties that have non-conforming front yard setbacks. And
right.
so in order to we're missing an opportunity to bring those into conformity. I think perhaps maybe the real discussion, or what is really negotiable, is which of these numbers should prevail. If we merge a 20 and a 15 district, should you keep the dimension of the larger district, or should you adopt the standard of the smaller district? In
That's
this
what
case,
I think. Yeah.
In this case, in this particular instance, and it's gonna vary depending on the setback we're talking about. In this particular instance, you can make strong argument that 20 isn't aggressive enough of a reduction. Let's just go with 20 and forget about this 15. Okay.
Yeah. So I think, personally, I think that it's a better way to explain it to people, to say, there'll be no change in the side and rear if we reduce this, and to point out what the reductions would be by just dealing with the 4, the 4 zones, and point it out instead of flipping back and hoping everybody remembers. So it's just maybe the way to present it. And to be honest with you, it would be nice to be able to say, if it remained at 20 as your example, this changes the nonconformity from, I'm making it up, 80% to 50. If we changed it to 15, for both of the districts, it makes it from 80% to 5. something like that. I don't know. Yeah.
I can't get those
Yep.
precise numbers because there'd be a tremendous amount of work involved to measure each one of those. And we
Okay.
don't unfortunately have like an automated way of doing that within GIS. Unlike lot size, we can do a quick an analysis in GIS, but because we're talking
Yeah.
about actually measuring individual setbacks, we can't readily run full set of calculations on that. We just basically have been doing it based upon sampling.
Okay. All right.
Francisco, this is
Yeah.
Clifton. I'd be a little worried about taking the larger lot area size and the larger standards, because in some cases, then when you merge, you're going to increase the number of nonconformities.
So I would say, Clifton, so long as we don't go above what is currently required in that district, that would be true. And in this case, in the 15s, the current requirement is 30 feet. So even if we went with the 20-foot standard instead of the 15, it's still lower threshold. It's still lesser standard, a lesser requirement. And so we would still be reducing
lot area as well too.
Right. So the lot area, the lot area is really driven. If I go, it's entirely driven. It's baked into the name of these districts. So 15 is 15. We're going down in lot size, unquestionably. That's the purpose. And we're not proposing at all that we would go up, that we bring RA 15 properties into the RA 20 lot size. It's just the question of the setback standards and frontage as well. Okay.
So,
Understood.
you know what? I personally feel that decreasing the overall lot size, but going with the higher front yard setback, I think it does decrease the nonconformity, maybe not to the degree, but I think it's more in keeping with it's less of a major change, right? And we still reduce the number of zones, we still reduce the nonconformity, and to be honest with you, I think people will be more accepting of it.
Okay.
I think the other might be a little bit aggressive.
So Lynn, based upon your concerns guidance, what I would recommend doing is within recommendation 20 is, as you've suggested, is we show what those recommended setback standards and frontage requirements would be based upon a zone change. So whereas these recommendations would occur independent of a zone change, of a zone merger or consolidation, these would be independent. We would within this recommendation prepare a parallel set of standards assuming a zone change so that it's more sensitive to the implications of that zone change. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I agree with that.
Okay, let's do that. I will prepare that.
That sounds like a good plan.
Okay. I will do exactly that. All right, let's move ahead. Recommendation 21 is to reduce permit requirements for accessory dwelling units and clarify regulatory language. And this isn't real big change. This just eases things slightly. So it would reduce the permit standard for ADUs and detached accessory structures, which is currently requires special use permit. It would reduce it to a site plan application. So in addition to pulling a zoning permit, you have to produce site plan, which makes sense when you're talking about an accessory structure. You want to know where it's being located on lot, how the parking's being handled, where the entrance is, how it abuts a neighboring property, et cetera. So they're just, it's a very simple change. It is impactful, but simple. And a site plan application is still pretty high standard. You still ask a lot of an applicant in terms of the amount of information they need to provide and what they need to comply with. And that is only in the districts we're allowed, so we're not talking about changing where ADUs are allowed. And we think, you know, there really hasn't been a lot of ADU development. We want to encourage some, and we think this might be beneficial. Maggie, I see your hand raised, and I'm really trying to keep things moving. So if you could real very quickly, a question or comment.
Do those houses, and thank you, do those
Yep.
houses, having accessory dwelling units, are they then still exempt as single family homes from zoning commission review?
Yeah, so all right. Well, first of all, the single family home. Okay, if a single family home and an ADU are built at the same time, I think that's your question. Do they? Yeah. The single family home would have to meet the zoning permit requirements. The ADU would require the site plan application.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so at no point would that trigger a special permit for the single family home.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, this is housekeeping in terms of how we go about implementing that recommendation, and we walked through this last time. We're talking about just cleaning up language. We're really not talking about changing the rules around this. The only change is that site plan application instead of a special use permit. Okay, all agreed to advance this, or let me hear from anyone that has objections to advance what we've recommended. Okay, no objections. Let's once again, we're not voting to adopt this. We're talking about we're agreeing to share this with the public as a recommendation at our virtual meeting 2 weeks from now, and to also put this online for people to review. Okay, recommendation 22 is to provide more flexibility in the open space development regulations to allow for a greater diversity of housing type. And what we mean by that is to allow duplexes and attached housing, also known as townhouses, to be developed within an open space development, which are currently limited to only single family homes. And the purpose of this is to just allow for greater diversity of housing types to meet housing need. Open space developments, you know, there's some pretty rigorous standards that have to be met to build an open space development. And we feel that a little more diversity in the housing supply within these open space developments would be beneficial. So we expect it may incentivize new development. There has not been a lot of subdivision development in Stonington or across Connecticut. The finances of that type of development are really not that favorable at the moment, with very high construction costs. You know, perhaps attached housing or duplex housing would make it a little more favorable. You might see a little more activity, and the town needs housing, so that would, by most measures, be a good thing. So how do you go about that?
So we had a very
Yeah.
depth discussion about the Architectural Review Board and giving
Yeah.
the Architectural Review Board kind of the feedback that we received from the public. And has that happened? And do they agree to that? Because we want to make sure we're all aligned before we present that to the public.
Okay.
So remember,
so-
you put up the pictures and all that, remember?
Yeah, Lynn, you're kind of getting ahead of me, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
You know, that's fine. Your comment is very appropriate. The question, at least, is very appropriate. So let's talk about that. So the way by which we've recommended regulating this type of development, being duplex or attached housing, is to only allow pre-approved housing types, so that the town has a measure of control over what is built. And if I jump ahead to what Lynn was talking about, I'm sorry, I don't have the images here. It was on the presentation before. So, and thanks again for bringing that up, Lynn. So what we've talked about, what we agreed to as an approach, and we have not agreed yet to move it forward, would be to allow duplex and attached housing only if pre-approved, which means the town would have a set of designs. And if a developer were interested in building something that comported that followed those designs, then that type of housing would be allowed. And of course, it would all be allowed. It would be allowed by special use permit. So it would be a fairly rigorous process by which that would be approved. It was our recommendation or thought that the most appropriate entity to basically oversee the development of those design standards and to evaluate proposals being consistent with those design standards would be your architectural design review board. To Lynn's point, I have not reached out to the ADRB. I do think it's incumbent upon us to make sure they're interested in fulfilling or satisfying this role. And we should probably do that before we present this to the public. That being said, we're not committing them to anything with this, just an idea. It seems consistent with the purpose of that board to review the design and appearance of structures. They would not be the board that ultimately approved such development. They would provide a report or a recommendation to the zoning commission that the proposal complies with a pre-approved housing type or does not, in which case the zoning commission could deny an application because it did not meet the design standards. So that is the process. That's what we're proposing. And I think what I can do is coordinate with staff, with Clifton, to follow up with someone at ADRB to gauge their interest in this. But I would recommend carrying this forward regardless, because we're not talking about setting this in motion. We're just talking about sharing this idea with the public. And they should probably hear it first.
Yeah, that's good. So let me
Yes.
just ask you one other question on what you were saying. So where in all of our documentation
Yeah.
will we have what those design standards are? Will that be
Yep.
part of the zoning? Will that be,
Yep.
with pictures or something? Is that how we're going to
Yep.
do it? Okay, thank you.
So I'm saying yeah, as in I understand your question, not yeah, as in that's what we will deliver.
Okay.
So we talked about this very briefly at our last meeting because I was trying to move things along. This recommendation is likely something that is going to take longer to be ready to adopt, meaning this process will not develop or identify those building typologies. Typically, what is required is that you either purchase a set of plans, and these are, there are many sites and businesses that deal in the business of selling design plans and blueprints that are pre-designed to the standards required for this sort of thing. It doesn't have all the mechanicals and electrical and plumbing and all that sort of thing, but it has what would be sufficient for this purpose. So what we are going to recommend as part of this recommendment is that the ADRB hopefully is engaged in that process. The town identify funding to either purchase pre-approved plans, to select them, or to hire a local architect to develop pre-approved typologies. That process would be separate from our work. We would basically outline exactly how this needs to come about, the process involved, and then there is subsequent work that is required to be done outside of our work. So I think this recommendation, may take longer. That work needs to be done first before this is adopted into the zoning regulations.
Perfect. That last line was what I needed to hear. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
And that will all be stipulated in the text of this recommendation.
Okay. And I think that's important for the public to hear too.
Yep.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah, I think it would likely be you would do all of that. You would absolutely do all of that, right? You do the homework, figure out what designs you'd like to advance. probably have a public process where you invite the public to weigh in on what designs they think are appropriate to the town, well before you bring this zoning recommendation to a public hearing for adoption. I think that would be the best process.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Clifton, I don't know how this happens, but if there's funds that need to be appropriated, you know, and we're looking to bring all of these to the public for a vote next year, I think we need to get going on that if it's going to happen before, right? So just something to think about in the timeline.
Yeah, Lynn.
As a matter of fact, it might be a separate timeline we want to track along with, you know, the overall timeline for adoption.
Yeah, Lynn, that's kind of what Francisco's saying. And what we would do is, you know, when this would come to a public vote, you know, sometime next year when we're doing the rest of the rewrite regulations, this wouldn't be one of those that would be approved at that time, just because it would require a different funding stream, a different RFP going out. I think the purpose of what, you know, Francisco is trying to do is, you know, get it out there that there's this approach that municipalities take in terms of creating pre-approved housing programs. What my thoughts are on this is that since that process is going to be so siloed or potentially siloed outside of the rewrite that we're working on now, my recommendation would be, like I said at the last meeting, to actually expand the scope of it outside of the open space developments and just say, how does the community feel about a pre-approved housing plan? Because I think that through the public hearing process and through the informational sessions, just getting the guidance on does the community support a pre-approved housing process, then we can talk about what does that look like and where would those locations be. So, you know, I'm for this. I'm for this recommendation. I would actually like to see it expanded in scope if possible.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you both. And so I will follow up with Clifton on this, but let's plan on bringing this forward, and we'll of course provide all this context for it at our public presentation. All right, let's move on to recommendation 23. This will reduce the lot size requirement for duplexes or triplexes. They require twice and 3 times the lot size respectively, which, you know, is logical. However, it's really a disincentive to building this type of housing. You know, one structure, one footprint is far more efficient, less impactful to land and to property. And so it seems not proportional to require twice the lot size for a duplex and 3 times for a triplex. It's kind of self-defeating. So what we recommend is reducing that to the single family lot size requirement if the proposed unit is a pre-approved housing type. So once again, this looks towards a pre-approved housing type approach. So if you don't build the pre-approved housing type, you still have to provide twice or 3 times the lot size. If you do use a pre-approved housing type, whether duplex or triplex, you can build on a single family lot, or a lot that it's the same size as what is required for a single family residence. Questions or comments on this?
So just to clarify, and I think I know the answer to this, but if you have a duplex or a triplex on a single family lot size or any lot, you are then not allowed to have an auxiliary dwelling unit. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, it's only allowed for single family homes.
I think we should be somewhere in our regs we should make that statement when we're
do.
talking about this. Okay,
Yeah, I mean, that's
Very
the only
clear.
place ADU is allowed. The changes we're proposing for the ADU is just to change the permit requirement, but it
Okay.
is strictly only allowed for single family residents.
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
okay, thank you.
I agree with this recommendation.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. All right, anyone else?
No, this is Ben. I agree with them. Always have. Looks good.
Okay.
Same for Gary. I like the carrot approach.
Yeah, there's a lot of strength to incentive-based zoning regs, and they're arguably more resilient in the courts because you're not forcing anyone to do anything. You're just providing incentive. If you do this, then you get more. Right? You're not forcing anyone to use a pre-approved housing type. You're just allowing them to use it. You're allowing them to get more if they do use it. Okay, let's move that
What do you
forward.
mean? What do you mean? Wait, what do you mean they don't have to use the pre-approved housing type if they do this?
No, if you build, currently right now, you are allowed to build a duplex on a lot that's twice that of the single family lot in the district, and a 3-family home. And this is in the districts where these are allowed. We're not talking about changing where duplexes and triplexes are allowed.
Right.
And you can currently build a 3-family home in the districts listed in that middle bullet,
Right.
but you need 3 times the lot size. So the incentive here is that if you choose to go with a pre-approved housing type, the incentive is that you only need a single family lot size. You don't need 2 or 3 times. So it's the incentive-based approach. We're not requiring anyone, if they want to build a duplex or triplex, to use a pre-approved housing type. Right? If they want to do that, they're just going to need 2 or 3 times the lot size. Does that clear it up?
Yeah, but what would be the downside? This is just
Yeah.
discussion purposes, and I know we're running out of time. But what would be the downside to say, and you need to use a pre-approved type, and we include something in our selection of types that would be on a larger lot or something like that?
Yeah.
Well, because I think when we presented it to the public and you got feedback on the public, I think maybe it was just me, but I was thinking that the pre-approved, that it would include all duplexes and triplexes.
Well, I think the results are what they are, since we don't have them. So obviously it's discouraging people as it is because of that lot size requirement. Otherwise,
So Lynn, yeah, thanks, Gary. You're right. You don't have many, and really the lot size requirement's a barrier to that. And we know that you need housing. You allow it, so the intent was to allow it. Now we're just trying to make it realistic. However, we're trying to put some guardrails around that so that what you do get is consistent with the vision of something appropriate to your community. Now, Lynn, if I could directly answer your question as to, well, why not just have pre-approved required for all? And here, I think we're on much firmer ground if we keep this as an incentive versus an absolute requirement. And what I mean by that is that pre-approved housing types are still experimental in Connecticut. To some degrees, that this approach is experimental across the country. They haven't yet been tested, well tested in the courts. They haven't been tested here in Connecticut. We know that zoning incentives are far more legally resilient to challenge than absolute requirements. We know that currently the requirement is that currently duplexes and triplexes are allowed with no pre-approved housing type requirement. So if we made a pre-approved housing type required for all of those, we're actually imposing additional requirements and standards on top of what is already allowed. And it is not proven that the town has the authority to exercise those requirements outside of a historic district or outside of a designated village district. And the areas we're talking about mostly are not. So we think that we are far more on much firmer ground, to use that expression again, if we make this incentive based, because we're not removing anyone's rights to do what they currently are allowed to do. We're only adding rights. We're being additive, not reductive.
Okay, thanks for the explanation.
Okay. All right. Thank you for the question. It's a great question. Okay, comfortable moving forward with this?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
let's move it forward. Very good. And just for everyone's benefit, you know, I'm in the weeds here with the details. In 2 weeks, our presentation is going to be a little higher level. There's going to be a lot less language, some more images. Okay. All right. Recommendation 24. Revise the attached housing standards to be less restrictive. So much like the duplexes and triplexes we just talked about, you allow attached housing in the town. You allow the RM20, RM15, RH10, PV5. In the PV5, it's fairly permissive. In the RM20, RM15, RH10, it's incredibly strict requirements to the point where it's just not feasible to build this type of housing. And so our recommendation is to change standards to make it feasible. So let me walk you through that. We would reduce the minimum lot size. Right now, you have to have 10 acres. For some districts, that's 10 times the lot size. That's otherwise for a single family house. We'd provide an option that would double the maximum number of units. Once again, incentive based. If you use a pre-approved housing type, we'll allow you to double the maximum amount of units that are allowed per acre. The open space lot area requirements are confounding. They're incredibly complex. They're not well defined. There are 3 different terms that are used somewhat interchangeably. It's really can be very difficult to parse one from the other. We really recommend just simplifying all of that. And not so much reducing what's required, but just changing it to a more proportional basis, like 10% of lot area instead of 1,000 square feet per unit. And so there's just a lot of cleanup there. I think it'll just make it easier to interpret and comply with the regulations while still requiring lots of open space that's private, open space that's commonly held, open space for active use, open space just for landscaping. To provide a little more flexibility in the building design to go up to 5 units, which is, you know, if you go into a condo complex, 5-unit buildings are extremely common. 4 units is you know, this isn't a magic, 5 isn't a magic number. It's just a little more permissive than 4. It may be that plenty of developers choose to build 3 or 4 unit buildings anyway, because they're just smaller pieces to fit into onto a site. And then reduce the required buffer to 10 feet in the RM20, RM15, RH10. Almost all these changes are specific to those districts. The PV5 is already far less restrictive and more permissive, so we're not recommending any changes to that.
What is the required buffer currently in the RM 2015?
Yeah, I believe it's 30. It's either 25 or 30 feet. In some cases, it's upwards of 50 feet. It's an incredibly huge area. I mean that I think it's 25 to 30. 50, I think, is congregate housing, which we'll cover in a minute. Anyway, it's an incredibly large area for a buffer when we already have setbacks. Now, we're not talking about setback here. We already have setback requirements in place. This is buffer. This is the amount of area within the setback that has to be covered with landscaping, trees, bushes, fencing, walls. So it in some cases, and it varies per district it's located in, it really seems quite excessive and designed just to treat these properties like they're nuisances and hostile land uses. When I agree a buffer is probably desirable, but yeah, you could fit a lot of trees and walls and fences into 10 feet.
Yeah, how does that work with bullet 3? Is it in addition to the minimum of 10% of area
that's
landscape?
on that buffer is just how that required open space is treated. So it's not that you're requiring additional space or additional proportion of the lot to be buffered. It's that whatever area is required, you require that depth of area to be covered with landscaping, walls, and fences.
Okay, thank
So
you.
it's not an additional area requirement. It's what goes in that area is the requirement. The depth,
Okay.
the depth of that landscaping that's required.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, and if you're in a single family residential building, a district, and you build a single family home, your buffer requirement is 0. Okay. All right, so I'm not gonna get into all this. Like I said, we've provided recommendations how to treat and handle open space, and we get rid of these complicated integral open space terms and all that. Design open space, go with private. It's either private or common, right? It's either exclusive to that unit or everyone has access. And so we're not reducing what's required, we're reclassifying it and simplifying it and making it more proportional to the lot. And likely the amount of open space that comes out of this change would be very likely exactly the same. The one difference being the buffer, depth of the buffer would be not as extensive. All right, so any questions, comments on the recommendations for changes to attached housing?
I'm good with it. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else?
This is Ben. I think it's fine. Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's move to 25. I just mentioned this, congregate living facilities are treated very much the same way as attached housing. Incredibly high standards required to build one of these. And once again, we're talking about a range of housing for seniors and the elderly with various levels or types of housing, including assisted living facilities, 55 and older housing, in a range of different types of units. So it could take a lot of different forms. It is allowed in a lot of your districts, both residential and commercial. And much like attached housing, we recommend decreasing and amending some of these standards to make it more feasible to develop these. Stonington, like most communities in Connecticut, has an aging population. A lot of baby boomers are in need of this type of housing. And if they have more housing available to meet their needs, by moving out of their homes, they could free it up for a young family. So our recommendations would be to reduce the minimum lot size from 15 acres to 5 acres. Included in the definition of congregate housing would be, buildings as small as with as few as 5 units. So why does a 5-unit building for seniors need to be on 15 acres? So cut that down to 5 acres. It's 5 acres still a very high bar in many of your districts in terms of putting together that amount of land. But far more reasonable than 15. And that would match what is currently required of convalescent homes, which is a very, very similar use. In some cases, there's some overlap between convalescent home and what qualifies as a congregate care facility. Reduce the yard requirement to twice the yard requirement of the district. The current yard requirement is, I think it's like 100 feet or something. And for our presentation in 2 weeks, I'll have a table to compare the numbers. So it's very straightforward. So reduce the yard requirement to twice the yard requirement of the district. So it still ensures that whatever's built is set back further than a single family home. It may be in proximity of, but it doesn't have to be an excessive distance. Replace the buffer requirement with the screening requirement. I don't want to get too far into this evening because we talked about the fact we've got a lot of work to do across the regs in really cleaning up and reining in these buffer and screening requirements. Those terms are used interchangeably. They're redundant or overlapping in some cases. They vary wildly from one use or one district to another. And so when we get to our work phase where we address site design standards, we're going to take this on. So it may be that we make some decisions in that process that feed back into this. This is an iterative process. Next would be to apply the screening requirement only to side and rear lot lines. There's currently a screening or buffer requirement for the front yard. So you've got to hide the front of the building behind a wall of landscaping and fences, which treats it more like compound and less like a part of the neighborhood. And reduce the screening depth to 50% of the required setback or to 25 feet, whichever is less. So we're still talking about a fairly deep buffer or screening depth. Right now it's up to, I think, 50 or 75 feet in some areas. So by reducing it to half the required setback, we'd get it into a more reasonable range, and it would be more proportional to the districts and the lot sizes required and the setbacks required in those districts. And then one more piece of housekeeping, we need to remove any reference to minimum unit size. That's no longer permitted by statute. That we really should have caught that in the first phase, but it's not too late. So that's the extent of our recommendation. Comments, questions?
So, this is Lynn.
Yep.
I think some of these requirements that are in the zoning are not really there to prevent this type of development, but rather to protect the residents. And, to make sure that they're not plunked down in concrete and have no place to walk, or the traffic is zooming past and there's not enough buffer and so it's not quiet, or they're not, exposed as much, because a lot of times, we're very fortunate in that we've got some great development now for the elderly, et cetera. But, a lot of times these are very cheap, and I just want to be careful that we look at it both ways, that yes, we definitely want to promote this kind of development to meet our population's needs, but we also want to protect it so that, it's nice, to be fairly honest, and they have good quality of life. And I had to say, without a table, it's hard for me to grasp all the numbers and how much we're reducing and what that effect is. I do think it's very important because, I've seen this done very badly, even in Groton, right? Yeah. And I've also seen it done very nicely over in Noank, right? So I think there's a lot of ways to do it, but every time I've seen it done well, it has a lot of green space. It has some buffer. It's nice. It allows people to go out and walk and not, I don't know. need to get that out there. So I'm
Yeah, so
I'm
let
kind of
me-
on the fence on this.
Yeah, all right, so let me directly address your concerns. First of all, in the document that we prepared, the recommended amendment, we've got a PDF document of all these recommended amendments that goes into far more detail than these slides do. I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but I believe we do have comparison of the existing versus the proposed standards. So you can compare number to number, or you could open up the regs and go into those and get an idea of what we're talking about. For the purposes of our meeting in 2 weeks, I'll do exactly that. I'll provide a table that shows exactly what we're talking about. It does vary a little bit by depending which district you're in, because some of these standards are vary per district. But I can put together make sure we have a summary table in our presentation. With respect to green space, we're still talking about requiring the exact same amount of green space. So there's no change there. It's really just the depth, the screening change. It's like 75 feet or 100 feet in some cases. 25 feet of screening can accommodate a lot of screening, like a lot of trees in that, and walls and fences. So we're still talking about maintaining screening. We are talking about removing screening from the front, which, I think is a good thing. We're not talking about removing landscaping from the front. We're talking about removing the requirement that the front of whatever it is be totally hidden from the road or the neighborhood, which I think is more in lines of being a good neighbor than anything else, and not treating something as a compound that needs to be hidden away. So I think we've been very cautious in our recommendations that whatever is built is not adversely impactful to the neighborhood. With respect to the traffic generated, that traffic's going to be there regardless whether it's 5 or 15 acres or where the screening is. Long ago you agree that these types of uses are acceptable in those districts where allowed. And there are controls on the density of these, how much can be built. You've got fairly stringent lot coverage controls. So I think there are a lot of other safeguards in place. I think it's just reining in the probably very well-intentioned, but fairly excessive standards that significantly, I think, reduce the feasibility of building these.
Okay. I just wanted to, I understand what you're saying. Again, I think some of these standards are really to protect the occupants and make sure they have a nice place to live versus, a very, so.
And I don't think we're talking about getting rid of anything that would diminish the quality of the experience for anyone living there or adjacent.
Okay.
Right. We're not talking about like allowing the lot coverage to go up to an exorbitant amount and reducing them. We're not talking about reducing the amount of open space required. All that would be maintained. We're just talking about some of these standards we see as being disproportional or excessive for what is really required to accomplish the intent, which is to make sure it's nice and make sure it's not adversely impactful to neighbors.
Yeah.
And we're just identifying something that I think accomplishes the same thing, but is more realistic.
Okay.
And wasn't that
And I do
something
think
that
the table would be nice in the presentation.
the community was
Okay.
concerned about that, correct? For the housing, for the elderly to increase it.
Yeah, we heard a decent amount of support for and interest in when we did the workshop for that type of housing, and some of the survey responses we've received to date, we've had fairly good support for senior housing, more assisted living, this type of housing. So we're
Yeah.
trying to be responsive to what the community seems comfortable with.
Yep.
and where the need is as well.
And I do think that just might be a market thing. If there's a luxury development that wants to have the 15 acres,
Yeah.
people might pay for it. I mean, that could just be
Yeah. Yeah.
something the market decides, you know, if someone chooses that, but be nice to have that option.
Right. And if they really do need to scale up for the numbers to work, for the finances to work,
Yep.
it's got to be at a certain scale and volume, then they're going to need that lot. They're going to need that extra lot area. They're going to need the 10 or 15 acres anyway, because they're allowed only so much per acre. You know, we've got controls already on that. Okay, so I think we're comfortable moving forward with this, and you'd just like for us to do a better job of comparing what's being proposed versus what's existing when we present it to the public.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Recommendation 26, yeah, we can move through this pretty quick. We should update and this is a tiny one, but it applies to your residential districts because keeping of domestic animals are identified as an accessory use. We had some conversations and we didn't get far with it as to, what's the right number of animals right now. Your regs say 2 of any species. We talked about, should that be 3? And that seemed to be a distraction from everything else we were doing, and it could take a life of its own. It doesn't really seem to be a problem right now, and so we just want to remove any problems that exist surrounding this language. So the way the language is currently written, if strictly interpreted, and I'm not sure this has ever been enforced, but the language is written that the keeping of domestic animals is only permitted on lots that meet the minimum lot area standards. So if you have one of the hundreds of non-conforming lots that we talked about earlier, non-conforming in lot size, as currently written, you're not allowed to have dogs or cats or parakeets. So needless to say, we recommend just getting rid of this provision or this particular line of text. And I think we have agreement across the board on this, correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we all like our
Yes.
pets. Yeah, we don't.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you. And that's how we do it. It's pretty simple. All right. Recommendation 27. This is far more substantial. Well, and it's in the name, no pun intended. We are recommending extending the look-back period of the substantial improvement definition. And let me explain what this is as a reminder. This pertains to your flood hazard district regulations and only applies to properties in your flood hazard overlay district, which encompasses pretty much any property that's in 100-year floodplain and coastal areas. Currently, the look-back period is 1 year. The look-back period, what that means is if a property is being improved substantially, let's say there's a huge addition being put on, a lot of remodeling, a gut job. If the value of those improvements are more than 50% of the value of the entire property, and this is contingent upon appraisal being conducted and estimates and that sort of thing, then that property has to be upgraded. Those improvements, those upgrades have to bring it into compliance with building code for flood hazard areas, which may mean elevating a structure or doing other improvements. Now, commercial and residential areas are not treated the same. In commercial areas, you have the option of flood proofing and making the structure more resilient to flooding, and various measures that would allow water to move through the structure and requirements for materials that are damaged by water to be above the flood line and materials are more resilient to be below. and that's intended to protect commercial structures. For residential structures, it basically means it means a lot of things, but one of the big implication is that the structure would need to be elevated. Now, where look back comes into play is that the value of those improvements, you only look back a year to add up the value of all improvements to a house. So if you hired one contractor to build a garage, and then several months later you hired another contractor to add an addition to the back, anything conducted in the past year would be totaled up, added up, to determine whether or not you added more than 50% of value to the structure. So the look back period is not real long. So if you build a year, take a year off, build a year, take a year off, and you could very quickly completely change, improve a structure, triple the size, add significant value by just spacing out those improvements without ever having to conform with flood hazard building zone building code regulations that would require the structure to be elevated, and many of the other things that go along with that. So this is a bit of a loophole. It's intentional. It's intentional so that it's not so that people can maintain, update their homes without that being counted against them in perpetuity. However, 1 year is not a long time, and you could kind of space things out and get around this entire regulation. For that reason, many communities have a 2, 3, or 5 year look back period. Stonington at one time changed, not that long ago, changed the look back period to 5 years. It was in effect for a few years, and then it was essentially reversed to 1 year. So what we're recommending is changing one word in the regs, and that is in the definition of substantial improvement, changing it from 1 to 3 year period, so that these regulations can't be essentially worked around by spacing out construction. 3 year would really it would catch more properties. So there are definitely more properties if substantially improved over a 3 year period would be required to upgrade the properties to be fully flood compliant and conforming with flood zone regulations. However, we don't think it's excessively stringent. It's 3 years is easier than 5. If you did improvements 4 years ago, you did a lot of improvements back then, they're not being counted against you. It's just the last 3 years. So it kind of closes the loophole, but it's still, it's not in perpetuity. It's not 5 or 10 years. Waterford, at one point, their regulation was in perpetuity. It was for the life of the structure. Going back to written records, if you had more than substantially improved your structure, more than 50% for the record of the property, you had to improve it to meet flood zone standards. I think they recently they got rid of that. They changed it. I think it's to a 3 or 5 year. All right, and that's all spelled out in the PDF document. We provide all that research and documentation. All right.
Francesco, this is Lynn.
Yes.
Just a quick technical question. What is the
Sure.
start and end of the project? Is it approval from either the town to move forward? Is that considered the start date? And then the new certificate of occupancy or, approval that the work is finished by the town? What are the bookends?
That is a fantastic question that I do not have a response for that I would be 100% sure is correct. Okay.
It's the zoning permit to the certificate of occupancy.
Thank you, Clifton. Thank you. Yeah, I thought it was the CO, but I wasn't sure.
I confirmed that with Candy.
Thank you.
That's how we apply it, Lynn.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I think that's important to know. Thank you. And just for the benefit of the presentation, you might want to just put that in part of the
I will-
definition.
Happy to be able to explain that. Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so back to this recommendation. Are we comfortable moving forward with this recommendation?
Yes.
Okay, I'm pretty sure we had agreement last time. I just want to make sure we're not getting cold feet.
Yep, this is Ben Philbrick. I have not flip-flopped.
Okay, all right. Good. Let's move forward with it. Okay, so that completes the recommended amendments that have come out of our process. And in the interim, we've had requests come in from resident. We talked about this last meeting. We had a request that churches, places of worship be allowed in the GBR 130 and potentially the RC 120, where they are not currently allowed. There is one church in the GBR 130, First Congregational Church, ECC. They would like to be able to expand their operations because they're a non-conforming use. Basically, they can't. So churches are allowed in many of your districts and by special use permit. There is a Justice Department ruling on how this subject needs to be treated by local zoning authorities. And that is covered by the RLU IPA. I'm sure people pronounce that as a word. I don't. And basically, the Department of Justice says that you need to treat churches like you would any other place that has comparable activities. So if you allow a social club in a zone, you have to allow a church there by the same permit type and apply more or less the same standards. And so on down the line. So what we found is we took a look at the town zoning. We found that the town is reasonably in compliance with this Justice Department ruling. And the regs as they currently written are probably very, very defensible. So we don't think that you need to allow churches in the GBR 130 to be in compliant with the Justice Department ruling. But you could make a case that because the town allows recreational facilities and other civic facilities like schools in the GBR 130, that those are comparable facilities because they're places where people gather, they are institutions. And there could be an argument made. Once again, someone would have to go to court, spend a lot of money to make this argument. So I think I think the regulations are fine as they are. So the real question is, to you, do you think we should allow churches in the GBR 130? It's not something that I'm recommending. It is a request that came from resident that I feel obliged to share with you and to entertain. Fred did gave this a lot of thought and provided comment, a lengthy response. He really looked at it from all angles. So here I hope I do him justice by paraphrasing and summarizing some of his comments. And Fred, I realize you're here, so feel free to speak up on this. But basically, you kind of looked at this. You said, well, as long as they meet the environmental and resiliency standards and everything else, then maybe it's not a bad thing, provided they have direct access to a property from a public street. However, I think you felt pretty strongly that in the RC 120, it's less appropriate. So maybe more so in the GB 130. And you ran an analysis, you found that 71% of properties in the RC 120 are residential. 25% of those properties are vacant land, open space. 9 of those are small marinas or campgrounds. 11 are some other unique type of property or a pre-existing non-conforming use. And there are no churches or places of worship in the RC 120. So probably a very strong argument. And then ultimately you conclude that the regulations have worked fine as they are, and we probably should continue to not allow churches or places of worship in those districts. Fred, anything you'd like to add to that? If you're still on the call with us, just unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I'm still here, Francisco. Thank you very much. I didn't expect to get such prominent billing. Um,
You put the work in.
well, yeah. Well, thank you. I wish I could take credit for having done the work, but I'll pass it along. Um, yeah, I don't. I guess we haven't seen a groundswell of people wanting to do such things. And the only other thing I would add is churches and other uses like that. eh, You know, you get a church building, you get an annex, you get parking area, you get sidewalks, and so forth and so on. It's really hard to not do all that and not infringe on the environmental issue. Uh, so I haven't seen a need, I guess.
Mhm.
I did point out that we do have a place of worship in RC 120, and we do have one in GB 130. I didn't get the impression that the UCC church, what we call the road church, was seriously impacted by the zoning restrictions. And I
Okay.
know, and you probably do too, that we have a huge debate going on about the one in the RC 120 zone. But
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I got it wrong when I said there are no churches, place of worship. I must have misread your response. So apparently there is one in the RC 120.
well, there shouldn't be, but it's there.
Okay. Yeah, but it is there. Yeah. Okay. Thank
That's the subject of a couple of lawsuits. That's we can't fix that here, but
Okay.
but I guess unless you had a need, I guess I don't see it. I don't see
Yeah.
why it would
I-
change this. And
I'm not. Yeah.
and if the road church has felt constricted by the uh, issue, I don't know that we've heard about it in planning and zoning
Okay.
or in the zoning board of appeals in all the years I spent on both boards.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll shut up now.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you very much, Fred. Anyone else, any thoughts on this? Like I said, I think the zoning regulations are adequately permissive as they currently are written and in compliance with the Justice Department ruling. So I don't think this is a compelling need, but it was shared with us, so I wanted to make sure you had a chance to entertain this request.
Yeah, this is Ben. I appreciate Fred's homework. It's very thorough, and I would agree with you, Francisco, that leave well enough alone.
Okay. Can I get one more person to agree with that, and we'll drop it, and I'll just document the fact that we discussed it and agree that we would not change it.
This is Gary. I agree.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm being mindful of time because I was really, really optimistic, and I'm glad Chuck wasn't here to witness it when I said this would take an hour. And Chuck would be holding my feet to the flames on that right now.
It's recorded, so don't worry, he'll hear.
Oh, yeah. I have to forget to upload it. I just have to edit out that part. All right, next steps in this process. So where do we go from here? And I've said this a few times tonight. We're going to carry forward everything we agreed to and some of the changes that we discussed, that I agreed to make into our public presentation in 2 weeks. That is a virtual public presentation. We'll get that meeting link and invite out this week. And the purpose of that meeting is to invite the public to attend the meeting. We will post all of these recommended amendments, and we have them all compiled into a PDF document in much more detail than I reviewed tonight. We will get that posted online on the town's website to make sure people are afforded an opportunity to review them, to come prepared. And I'm going to have a much briefer presentation, and we reserve as much time as we need for Q&A with the public. Once again, at that meeting, we will not be making any decisions regarding adopting any of these. Based upon the feedback that we get from the public, we may decide to leave some of these amendments behind, or we may carry them all forward later on further into the process. And months from now, we will, and maybe a year from now, we will begin holding public hearings to adopt some of these amendments or all of them. Okay. We are getting near the end of our review of the residential zoning districts. So while we're moving into this public virtual meeting, at our next meeting, our next regular meeting next month, we will kick off and discuss commercial, industrial, and mixed use districts and uses. And so that virtual presentation is Wednesday, the 26th at 6 o'clock, not at our regular time of 7. We're trying to make this a little easier for the public, so we're not taking their entire night. 6 p.m. we will hold that meeting. And our next regular meeting is July 24th at 7 at our regular time of 7 o'clock. So with that being said, I would like to open discussion up to any members of the public that have been patiently sitting through our discussion to answer any questions or receive any comments from any of the members of the public attending. And please either just raise your hand using the raise hand feature or just unmute yourself and speak up. The floor is yours. Okay, I think if there were any attending, we've either hopefully have answered their questions, addressed their concerns, or they're holding their questions and comments for the public meeting, which is great, or we just tired them out. So for those of you that attended this evening, please do join us again in 2 weeks on the 26th. And we'll provide a very similar presentation. It'll be a little higher level, a little less text, a little more comparison of the numbers, as Lynn points out, is needed. Other than that, this concludes my presentation. And Ben, just for the sake of formality, I'll hand it back over to you to officially close the meeting.
Yes, thank you very much, Francisco. It's a good meeting. I thought you rolled right through it. And with your addition of a couple more tables for the public presentation, I think it looks good. And hopefully we'll get some positive feedback from that presentation. So if there are no other comments, I guess we're adjourned.
Thank you
very much,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And as usual, we will distribute a PDF of this presentation by tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.